Hello and welcome to Views on News. I'm Jawad Tehami. Many around the world will be celebrating a new year in a couple of days from now, but that is obviously not going to be the case with the oppressed Muslim minority in the so-called largest democracy in the world, that is known as India, and also that is not going to be the case for the oppressed people in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The question is why the Indian Muslims would be having any sort of celebration when discrimination against them by the Hindutva-driven brigade, which is led by Bharatiya Janata Party that forms the central government in India, is not only rampant but also brutal. At the same time, why would Kashmiris in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir will be celebrating a new year? Because since inception and the partition of Indian subcontinent in 1947, when India unilaterally and illegally took over this territory by force, the years for Kashmiris had been similar. And to date, they are waiting for that promise by the United Nations to be fulfilled, that they would be given the right to self-determination. The situation worsened, especially after the 5th of August 2019, when India unilaterally and illegally usurped their fundamental rights by revoking Article 370 of its constitution that snatched their autonomy. So there doesn't happen to be any question for any sort of celebration for the Kashmiris in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The international community and the international human rights organizations have been repeatedly raising alarm on this particular matter. But this particular thing has fallen on the deaf ears of the Indian authorities. Perhaps because nothing concrete has yet been done in order to hold Indian authorities accountable. Now, what needs to be done? What happens to be the responsibility of the international community in this regard? And how there has been the discrimination against Muslims within India that has been rampant and brutal, and how the human rights in Kashmir, Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, have been usurped by the Indian authorities and the Indian occupying forces over there. To look into these questions, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Dr. Owais bin Wasi. He is Kashmiri leader. Dr. Wasi, thank you very much for your time, for being on Views on News. And we are also honored to have been joined in the studio by Brigadier retired Mohammed Zeeshan. He is DG, Center for Peace, Security and Development Studies. Brigadier Zeeshan, thank you very much for your time also, for being on Views on News. And at the same time on Skype, we are being joined from London, UK, by Mr. Sami Hamdi. He's Managing Director of the International Interest. Mr. Hamdi, thank you very much for your time also, for being on Views on News. Let me begin the discussion with you, Brigadier Zeeshan. Many in the world will be celebrating a new year in a couple of days from now. But that's, of course, is not going to be the case for the Muslims in India as well as the Kashmiris in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Don't you think this is the time for the international community and the major world powers that a huge chunk of humanity in a certain region is deprived of their basic and fundamental rights even in the 21st century?
Thank you very much, Jawad. I fully agree with you, whatever you have explained in your opening remarks. In my personal opinion and in the opinion of many analysts around the world, whatever is happening in India is detrimental not only for the peace and harmony within India, but now it is being discussed that this Hindutva psychology is going to become a threat not only for the region but around the world. We have seen and we have observed a number of happenings around the world which have been in some way not much projected on the media, where extremist Hindu ideologies were projected on various Western medias. There are various organizations in the North America, in Europe, who are pursuing their Hindutva agenda outside India also. The famous NRI community in United States and in Europe, they, some part of that NRI community is aligned with the Hindutva psychology. Now, coming back to your question, that at the eve of New Year's, the 2023 is almost there. Where are we standing? Frankly, a recent terminology has been coined that we are right now in a rule-based chaos, and there is a rule-based disorder around the world. And within this disorder, there is a space for nationalist ideologies to usurp power in democratic and systems where people are oppressed, democratic systems. Similarly, India at this moment has an opportunity to go ahead with their agenda. And I would like to mention it that whatever election slogans BJP, and especially, if I may say, Narendra Modi had since his coming to power first in 2014, he has always gone and he has executed those promises in pursuance of Hindutva ideology.
But Brigadier Zeeshan, but it's not only Hindus which are present in India. There are so many other communities also which are existing over there, and that's why there is diversity over there. So we see a clear deviation from that principles or the slogans of the founding fathers of India. So there is a clear deviation. So doesn't it happen to be a sort of a threat for India itself and its existence? The kind of discrimination that is rampant over there, not only with Muslims, but also with other communities as well.
If we go back to the times when India got independence from British Raj, at that time this Hindutva ideology was there, but it was suppressed because of the diversity in India. India has a very rich, diverse culture and ethnicities and religions. Like 20% of Indians are not Hindus, and within the rest of the 80%, 68% Hindus are from scheduled castes. So within this, fractured system, they needed secularism, and they adopted it, and they very successfully gained a lot of mileage out of it. But right now it is majoritarian politics in India, majoritarian in terms
especially
of Hindus.
After the BJP took over the power back in 2014. Ever since, we have seen the international human rights organizations have mentioned this particular thing, and most recently the United Nations Human Rights Council and its Universal Periodic Review has also mentioned this particular thing. Dr. Wasi, your take, the Kashmiri students over there in Indian universities also meted out that discrimination. They are even beaten and tortured. What is the situation for the students in India, particularly that belong to Kashmir?
As far as the Kashmiri students' plight is concerned, that is equally deplorable, as was just mentioned by Brigadier Saab about the plight of Muslims. Kashmiris, unfortunately, they are doubly marginalized because one, they are Muslims, and the second, they are Kashmiris. So in this way, they are, the students, especially when at some occasion, when at times Pakistan won cricket match and they had some celebration, and they were arrested, and they were arrested under those laws which are draconian laws, anti-terror laws. So I think that within India, it's very unfortunate that there is no space for people of Jammu and Kashmir in general, and students of Kashmiri who are studying in different Indian universities in particular.
So what happens to be the option at the hands of the students who want to acquire higher education?
The option is that within India that they go to different places, particularly in Aligarh University and some other states, universities in JNU also, Jamia Millia also. But if those options, they are pushed to the wall, so they are bound to go abroad for higher education. So within India, the doors for education are not only curtailed, but they are completely stopped for Kashmiris.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. Hamdi into the discussion also. Mr. Hamdi, when we talk about the certain communities, then we see them being suppressed so repeatedly, time and again, with all the brutal tactics. What does that actually lead to? That create the danger of implosion in a certain country that is so huge and claims to be the largest democracy in the world.
I think what's important to note first and foremost is that the ideology, the Hindutva ideology, this rabid ideology that's being implemented in India, that is resulting in millions of Muslims being repressed and oppressed in India itself. I think that to note is that Modi thrives off this. I think that Modi's elections have always been about capitalizing on the divisions, creating this sort of public enemy for his supporters, and essentially striking fear in their hearts. If they don't vote for Modi, then these guys are going to come back, and these guys are going to essentially impose a way of life that Hindutva ideology absolutely rejects. And the reality is that this.
Right, Brigadier Zeeshan, what does it actually lead to when certain communities, when we talk about Muslims, they happen to be over 200 million over there in India. What sort of an impact does this suppression have on the social fabric of a certain country?
Basically, frankly, it has marginalized the Muslims in the India to an extent where the free and fair availability of education, opportunities of employment, opportunities to doing business, they have been curtailed to a great extent. And when the society is groomed and it is pushed into prejudice, and society which is led by Hindus and Hindus who are now greatly influenced by the majoritarian politics, by the slogans raised based on Hindutva. Hindutva is basically against the Muslims. And I feel really no hope for improvement of the life of Muslims in the India. Although that not every state is having those extremist tendencies, but previously in 2018, 21 states were governed by the BJP government, and today it is about, I think, 17, 18 states are in the under the BJP government. So this psychology is going to damage the prospects and the future of the youth, Muslim youth in India. And if you see, which we can see if we go into the communities residing in UK particularly, basically they are mostly Muslims, and they are mostly the Kashmiri Muslims who just run out of India because they have no hope for any prosperity or any equal rights in India.
So does that lead to any sort of reaction, Dr. Wasi, also at the same time? This kind of, the application of this psychology will definitely have a psychological impact on the larger community as an overall. So does it lead to reaction? And if it leads to reaction, so what, don't you think the Indian authorities should be cognizant enough of the repercussions of their behavior?
Yes, of course. Yeah, there is a possibility of that reaction, and recently what we are observing is that India is not being run by its constitution and the democratic values it professes at international fora. It is unfortunately being run by the ideology, which is Hindutva ideology, and which is inspired by this whole RSS framework. So the cosmopolitan and the pluralistic culture which India claims, if it instead of employing it and instead of applying it, if it adopts Hindutva ideology, so it damages Indian fabric of society, and also it would be detrimental to the Indian state also. As recently, they have also introduced the policy of Hindi language dominance, and there would be a possibility that it would be a strong reaction from South, it would be a strong reaction from the West, because Hindi is spoken by a certain part of India, And similarly, many other measures which are being taken. And recently, today, I came across the news that they have vandalized some people. They have vandalized a church there. So it also provoked Christian, and there might be a reaction from Christian community. And Muslims are also, they are agitating, and they are reacting.
This is a very important point that you've just highlighted, imposing Hindi on the other communities as well. So that will naturally bring in the reaction from the other communities when we see it is spoken by the states up in the north, and there is naturally going to be reaction from the states in the west and also in the south. Do we see any movement, the nationalist movement, based on this particular thing in these states that you have just mentioned in west and the south?
Now currently there is a simmering discontent, and there is a simmering resentment among the people. Now there is no organized movement so far, we can say, but later on there is a chance that an organized full-fledged movement can be launched by these people, especially in the west and south, because they do not identify with the policies being implemented by BJP regime. And another point that I would like to add is that the similar practice that they have done, Amit Shah, he said that they wanted to introduce this Devanagari script instead of this Kashmiri, and in Kashmir, instead of Urdu, they also wanted to replace Urdu with Dogra, especially in Jammu belt. So there would be a reaction if that policy remains.
Right. Mr. Hamdi is back with us. Mr. Hamdi, Dr. Wasi has mentioned a very important point that there are efforts by the BJP to impose Hindi all across on other communities as well. So there have been some reaction when we talk about West Bengal and Tamil Nadu also, but there are certain justifications given by the Indian authorities, particularly the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah. Let me quote him, that if there is one language that has the ability to string the nation together in unity, it is the Hindi language. But there are reactions to this statement. For example, according to Ganesh Narayan Devi, one of India's most renowned linguists, who dedicated his life to recording India's over 700 languages, said the recent attempts to impose Hindi were both laughable and dangerous. Your take regarding this? Mr. Hamdi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well, yes.
So this particular point, the efforts by the Indian authorities to impose Hindi all across, there have been reaction in West Bengal and Tamil Nadu, while Home Minister Amit Shah saying that this language is going to keep India united. But there are reactions coming from others also that this effort by Indian authorities is laughable. Your take regarding this?
I think that it's important to note that those who support Modi tend to support him on the basis that somehow the Hindu ideology and the Hindi language is being lost as a result of globalization, as a result of the various different systems that have been in place that have sought to accommodate the diversity of India, whether that's with regards to the Muslims or with regards to the Tamils or the like. And therefore, when we talk about the BJP, the narrative that they feed to their supporters is that if we are not proud of our identity, if we do not impose it, then we are essentially going to lose it. In other words, it's coming from a sense of fear, not from a sense of superiority. It's coming from this sense that they believe that Modi represents this sort of Hindu savior that is going to rescue India from becoming this cosmopolitan identity that drowns out their uniquely Hindu identity. And I think that it's important to understand what's happening from this perspective. The idea being that until now, those who support Modi do not have this vision at this moment in time, or are not convinced of this vision at this moment in time of an India in which everybody is able to live together. And this is what links to the point in that where Modi thrives is in presenting this apocalyptic vision of what will happen to his supporters if they do not vote for him. This idea being that the Muslim community will become stronger and the Tamils will become stronger, and therefore you will be essentially eventually become a minority. Very similar to what we hear sometimes in France, this idea that one day we might have a Muslim president and therefore we should be careful with regards to our French language and our French identity. Essentially it comes from fear, and what Modi fears the most is dialogue between the communities that essentially humanizes these communities and forces many of his supporters supporters to actually think again about their support for him. And one example would be one of a famous yoga practitioner who decided to look into Islam after Modi was attacking the Muslims, and then she posted a video of herself 1 year later next to the Kaaba in Mecca, saying that she had suddenly realized that Islam was the truth, and Islam was a religion that was far different from the manner in which Modi was presenting it. So I think these decisions that are being taken from a position of fear, a position of identity crisis, and the reality is it's also coming from a position in that those who support Modi are unable to visualize their place in this world of diversity. And this is why I think that rather than them accusing everybody else of being backwards, I think the reality is that it is their tunnel vision that prevents them from seeing what Modi doesn't want them to see, which is that India is bigger than Modi, it's bigger than the BJP, and its history has a very long and rich history in Islam itself that never wiped out Hinduism, but found a way to live alongside it that allowed both the Hindus and the Muslims to thrive.
Right, Ms. Hamdi, your point is well taken. Brigadier Zeeshan, when we talk about this language controversy, it's not new to India. It was there when there was the movement for a separate homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent, also the Hindi-Urdu controversy, and now we have seen such sort of discrimination being meted out to other minorities over there and other ethnicities over there by BJP brigade. Now, what does that actually depict? What sort of a mindset that is? Because language happens to be the cultural identity of a certain community, and the international conventions, even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, give the very right to every community to speak their own language.
Language is one issue which has been seen historically the most sensitive. Even at times it is more sensitive than faith. Why language is so sensitive to the people? Language is sensitive because language has culture in it, and you can express your culture in a particular language because you have history, you have terminologies, you have stories, and that can only be accurately depicted or conveyed or conversed or communicated with in a particular language which that culture belongs to. Now, 22 languages in India are official languages. If you see national languages, and if Hindi is to be seen, Hindi is basically spoken by 27% of Indians. Now, imposing Hindi over rest of the people, we have all gone abroad and interacted with South Indians. They have no understanding of Hindi or Urdu. They have very different language, and they mostly converse in English as a common language with the rest of the Indians or outside. So this language issue, I think it is going to fall on its face, and they may try to make it a national language, but their purpose is basically to propel the ideology of Hindutva, as they have been doing in most of the other cases, like the citizenship issue they have created, and now it is difficult for them to wrap it up. They don't know what to do with this language issue. I would also like to highlight that other than the language issue, the religious extremism, which has been expressed by recently, some months back, by the functionaries of BJP, especially the spokesperson of BJP, national spokesperson, and the reaction it received from no other than the US Secretary Blinken. They have condemned it. OIC condemned it. GCC condemned it. Various other Muslim countries condemned it, and the pressure was built upon the Indian government to expel those individuals from BJP. So we can see that in the name of religious extremism, the international community did pressurize Indians, and BJP.
So do you think that expulsion was sufficient, or there should have been more action against those people?
It may not be sufficient, but the pressure was also not sufficient. And what I'm trying to say that if the international community is taking note of what is happening, and they want the Indian government, irrespective of their economic strength, they will have to listen to the international community.
But Brigadier Zeeshan, when it comes to taking a sort of a concrete action, for example, imposing sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for religious persecution, there was a report by the US annual religious freedom designation listing that was by the State Department, in which the State Department did not include India in the list of the countries of particular concern, which was highly recommended by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. It also recommended the American administration to designate India as a country of particular concern and impose sanctions on individuals and entities who are involved in the religious persecution. So this, do you consider it a sort of a duplicity? Because on one side, the State Department doesn't consider India to be enlisted into the countries of particular concern, yet there is a strong recommendation by another department, that is the Commission on International Religious Freedom.
United States policy regarding India is fairly clear to all of us. They regard India as the main strategic partner in their Indo-Pacific strategy, which is targeting China. And secondly, as we all know that India is soon going to be the third largest economy of the world, so that is also one aspect that United States cannot ignore. Recently, what we have seen in terms of India ignoring United States demands on Russia and trade with Russia, and still United States could not impose any kind of sanctions, or United States could not censure India. Those are the things which tell you a lot that what kind of duplicity we have in US policy towards third world, towards human rights, towards religious rights.
Right. Dr. Wasi, your take regarding this particular economic interest of the major world powers, including the US, towards India. Now, after the kind of discrimination and the suppression to the minorities over there in India, so no matter how much economic development and growth you have at a certain specific time, but after such a suppression, do you think such economic development growth happens to be sustainable in the longer run?
You know, as far as this international sport is concerned, India is enjoying international sport because of multiple factors. One is that its geostrategic position and US interest to this Asia-Pacific policy. And, you know, but the matter of the fact is that in the long run, if India continues to adopt these policies and continues to run these policies in that state, I don't think that it will bear the heat of the international criticism. You know, it's not durable. It's not. It cannot be run in the longer term. So I don't think that it can be durable, it can be sustainable.
Right. Mr. Hamdi, your take regarding this, when there is so much suppression like that going on in a country, and when we talk about the role and the responsibility of the major world powers, including the US, as I've already put forth, there was a strong recommendation by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom to the State Department of the United States of America to include India in the list of the countries of particular concern. Yet the State Department didn't do that. So when we talk about this thing, this kind of reaction by the State Department towards India in particular, many experts believe it is because of the economic interest the US has got with India. Now, the economy is run by the people and for the people. And if a certain time span gives you a certain economic growth and development, do you think after such a suppression on such a large scale, this economic development and the prosperity happens to be sustainable in the longer run?
This is a bit difficult to say. I think first and foremost, it's important to highlight that one, the US is not particularly interested in human rights with regards to its foreign policy. And I think you're right in that it prioritizes political and economic interest. It needs India as part of this push against China. It needs India as part of this sort of pursuing its policy in the Indo-Pacific, particularly as Pakistan itself and other countries begin to publicly express their concern over how US policy has affected their own interests in the region, and legitimately so. the second point that's worth noting is that if you picture yourself or you imagine yourself as a US official who's in Washington, who is trying to propose to Biden, to say to Biden, we need to put pressure on India. If Biden turns around and says to you, but Modi was in Abu Dhabi being received with warm arms by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. The Saudis are investing more money despite their persecution of Muslims. When we look at the other Gulf countries who have the power to really put economic pressure, even when Nupur Sharma criticized the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, although we saw statements of condemnation, those statements were as a result of trying to appease their own people as opposed to actually denouncing Modi. In other words, the message that was delivered to Modi, the message that was delivered to India was, whatever you do to the Muslims would not affect our economic cooperation, it will not affect our investments, and we will put more money in India. So if you're Biden and you're sitting, you're not going to be thinking that you're going to be more royal than the king. You're not going to be more royal than the Muslims. So what Biden says is that in the overall grand scheme of things, given that the Gulf countries are not going to do anything, given the Muslim world is only going to be giving words or the Muslim states as opposed to Muslim world, Muslim state will only give words, then what we will do is give a slap on the wrist, we'll get Antony Blinken to put out a tweet, and then we'll continue as is. And I think that's the tragedy of what's unfolding, in that when Modi scrambled to release these statements to say that the BJP respects all religions, which was an unprecedented statement, Modi did that because he was terrified that the Muslim world would actually do something. He knew that the Muslim world could actually punish him. He knew that economically he could suffer as a result of his repression. What made Modi feel relaxed was that this punishment that he expected never materialized. This punishment that he believed would actually cause economic harm and harm his chances at re-election and harm his position inside India, that punishment never emerged. So when we're looking at the international reaction, I think it's important to state that it's not just the US, but it's also this attitude that is coming from Muslim states themselves.
So, Mr. Hamdi, your point is well taken. So what after this particular episode?
They're not worth pressuring Modi, but instead Modi is an ally who should be welcomed. He should be hugged when he comes to Abu Dhabi. He should be embraced, and that's
so what was the lesson learned after this particular episode, Mr. Hamdi? Beg your pardon for the interruption. What was the lesson learned after this particular episode, especially to the Muslim world, and what needs to be done on that front, and what sort of a role do you think the Organization of Islamic Cooperation can play in this regard?
I don't know how much one can say on TV. I think the reality is that if we remember in 2019, there was this Kuala Lumpur summit that was about to take place in Malaysia that many Muslims saw would reflect a huge shift in the way that the Muslim world would approach issues related to Muslims themselves. States that were concerned about this particular summit came in and essentially strong-armed other Muslim nations to make sure that they don't embark on this particular shift. I think the reality is that in the past 5 years, the leaders who perhaps were very loud, who were very firm in denouncing these issues, they've been removed one by one. We see many of these leaders now are no longer present, and we see that currently there is this sort of affirmation of trying to maintain a status quo, this series of reconciliations taking place. I know I speak in vague terms, it's mainly not to get anybody in trouble, but the point being is that when it comes to the Muslim world, the lesson that was learned is that the leaders who actually want to do something are being repressed not by the Western states, but by the Muslim states themselves. Whenever the poet Bulqasim al-Shabi, who says that when somebody stands up calling for that which is good, everybody around him, his own brothers, come and try to quash him instead. So I think that when we're looking in terms of the lessons of the Muslim world, we learn that the Muslim world has the power to do something. Modi was scared, Modi was panicking. The Muslim world has the power to do something, but as it stands, the current leaders are unwilling to do anything, and instead...
Your point is well taken. The Muslims have the power when they decide to do something collectively on this particular front. And the OIC, of course, has an important role to play in this particular regard. Dr. Wasi, now going on to Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Since 5th of August 2019, it's been almost 3.5 years. What's the situation? The Indian government and the authorities have been saying that there have been development going on since that particular revocation of Article 370. But the statements coming from the Kashmiri leader state something very otherwise. As former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti has also said that the democracy is suspended, and the people are being silenced, jails are filled with the IIOJK people, and the youth are being beaten and tortured. Is the situation over there any different?
The situation in Jammu and Kashmir after 2019, 5th of August 2019, is very grim. And now, quite recently, apart from other inimical measures that India took with regard to domiciles, now they have started seizing properties of Muslims, to dispossess the native Kashmiris from their own land. And this is the same policy which India, in fact, India has adopted from Israel, and India is trying to replicate the same in Kashmir. Second thing about the information, that there is a kind of communication blockade over there. Journalists are being arrested, students are being arrested, and under the draconian law, especially UAPA. So now it's very difficult to have information from what's going in the valley. So the situation by and large overall is very
has worsened.
Worsened. In fact,
over the years.
it has worsened, and it's very painful because the whole Kashmir has turned out to be a prison, and the Kashmiris are suffering from an unbearable trauma. So, but in this, in response to your question, I would also like to share that this Indian practice that India has violated this, not only the India's own constitution, it has violated not only international covenants, international agreements, it has not violated international human rights reports, it has also violated all the bilateral agreements between India and Pakistan. Since partition plan, India violated. Nehru Liaquat Pact, India violated. Then this Indus Water Treaty, India violated. Simla Accord, India violated. And Lahore Declaration, India. So you name it, and you will find the example of violation.
Brigadier Zeeshan, so many violations of international conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when it comes to bilateral pacts with Pakistan on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir, there have been so many violations and blatant violations. Yet, the international community, and especially when we talk about the largest organization in the world, the United Nations, stands same only passing on the comments and very occasionally condemning what is going on over there rather than taking any sort of concrete action. Why is that so?
Speaking realistically, if I want to help somebody, I need to have sufficient resources and economically viable myself. Pakistan not being at a status where it is economically prosperous, economically strong, Pakistan will never be able to voice its concern, pursue a foreign policy where Kashmir, as we say, is one of the leading foreign policy agenda Pakistan has all across the world.
It had been the cornerstone of Pakistan's foreign policy. Pakistan has always supported this Kashmir cause at all the international fora, diplomatically, morally, and politically.
But
what else needs to be done?
Oh.
Pakistan has been sensitizing the international community number of times, repeatedly, time and again, that Kashmir dispute happens to be the nuclear flashpoint in this particular region. And the international community needs to do something concrete in that regard. So Pakistan has been playing its role.
Pakistan has been playing its role, but international community will only listen to Pakistan when Pakistan is of some benefit to them. And we can only be of benefit to international community, especially the West, which has the powers to enforce something around the world. It's based on economic relations, and if we are economically strong. So realistically speaking, we have to focus on our economics, and only then we'll be able to actually support the Kashmiri cause.
So that implies that everything is associated with economy, and there doesn't happen to be any place of the UN Charter, the purpose and the principles of which were to secure, to have the security globally, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enunciated clearly the fundamental rights of every human being, regardless of their caste, creed, color, religion, ethnicity, and even the economic status. That is very clearly written in that.
As I said, realistically speaking, everything is
right.
around.
Mr.
One thing that I just would like to make a comment that I think these both things should go simultaneously. We cannot wait for the economic development and economic prosperity. That is quite right principally and realistically, that in international relation it is generally said that it matters that if you are, where you, what you are standing economically, but at the same time, you are raising voice, your contribution in international fora, because if Pakistan waits for this kind of variable to be developed, then it gives a message to Srinagar, which is it could be quite dangerous for that, because Pakistan might lose that that erode that constituency, that people are looking towards Pakistan.
Pakistan, again, I repeat that Pakistan has been repeatedly highlighting this issue at all the international fora. And most recently, we have seen the OIC Secretary General, Mr. Hussain Brahim Taha, also came into Pakistan, and he visited the line of control, and the kind of atrocities Indian occupying forces are committing on both sides of the border by cross-border shelling. Also, he categorically said that the world needs to know what India is actually doing. And let me go to Mr. Hamdi. Now, when we talk about the Kashmir issue, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the subsequent international conventions speak clearly and categorically of upholding the fundamental human rights, but they are being usurped when we talk about the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, especially the situation worsened after the 5th of August 2019, after the revocation of Article 370. So where that role and the responsibility of the United Nations that promised with the Kashmiris that you would be given the right to self-determination, to decide your fate and future as per your aspirations?
I think that the United Nations Charter is absolutely clear, and I think that it is in favor of the Kashmiris. What's missing is somebody to lead on this issue and to actually have a block through which to actually force the imposition of the United Nations Charter. And I think that's what Pakistan in the past 5 years was trying to do via the OIC, and did it so successfully that many in the Muslim world, many Muslim states, many in the Muslim world started to understand more about Kashmir, but the Muslim states themselves started to feel significantly under pressure to actually do something as a result of the numerous extraordinary meetings that were being called to discuss Afghanistan, to discuss Kashmir, to the extent that many Muslim states were trying to say to Pakistan, listen, you're putting us in a very uncomfortable position, you need to find some way to lessen this, we don't want to focus on Kashmir now. And Pakistan instead was responding with even more meetings by saying we need to talk about Kashmir. The point being is that while many people talk about the issue of the economy, and I agree to some extent, Pakistan demonstrated over the past 5 years how it can force the issue of Kashmir into the Muslim conscience, into the conscience of the Muslim states, force it onto the agenda to the extent that it evokes a reaction. In the case of Pakistan, the reaction that it evoked in the Muslim world was one in which they tried to make Pakistan quiet down a little bit. But the point being is that the only reason they reacted like that is because Pakistan was gaining traction in imposing the issue of Kashmir. Going back to the United Nations, when suddenly there is this block that is forming, this voice that becomes louder, whether that's coming first from Pakistan and then Turkey and then Saudi Arabia and then these other countries, eventually at the United Nations Committee, they cannot ignore these calls. Suddenly Kashmir becomes an issue whereby action has to actually be taken. And this is where I think Pakistan over the past 5 years was really trying to push in this particular direction. It really forced a momentum. I think given perhaps perhaps that given the world has shifted towards greater chaos as a result of Ukraine, Russia, a lot of domestic instability in some of the Muslim countries, it's resulted in rather this momentum sort of fizzling out a little bit. But the point being is that the last 5 years, Pakistan demonstrated how can put Kashmir at the fore of the issues. I think that the reality is that if you can shout about it louder, if more people are aware of it, then the reality is eventually you get to a position where the United Nations has to move. And I think that given the bridges that are now forming between Pakistan, between Turkey, between other Muslim countries as well, I think that voice is getting louder and the trajectory is certainly more positive than it has been in the past.
Right, your point is well taken, Mr. Sami. Hamdi, Managing Director, the International Interest, joining us from London, UK on Skype. Your time was highly appreciated and we were honored to have been joined in the studio by Brigadier Retired Mohammad Zeeshan, DG, Center for Peace, Security and Development Studies, and Dr. Owais bin Wasi, Kashmiri leader. Thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News. And that's all from today's Views on News. Until the next one, take good care of yourselves.